I'd like to introduce Pranav Rajpurkar, who is a PhD candidate at Stanford University, and he works in the area of AI for medicine, which we're kind of growing here at UW. He works in multiple different modalities, not just image analysis, but also natural language and other kinds of modalities that can lend themselves to decision making for medical purposes and leading to better patient care. He has published more than 30 peer-reviewed publications in scientific journals and also in AI conferences. And he did something quite unusual. He founded something called the AI for Healthcare Boot Camp at Stanford, where he works with undergraduates and collaborates with faculty members. He has also designed a set of Coursera courses on AI for medicine, and he's had more than 40,000 students in that. And finally, he was jointly advised by Dr. Andrew Ng and Professor Percy Liang at Stanford. And he's had all his degrees from Stanford, so let's hope that he's ready to go out and see the world. So with that, I give you Pranav Rajpurkar.
Great. Thank you for the kind intro, Linda. And thank you for having me here today. I'm excited to talk about the advancements and challenges for deep learning in medical imaging. So over the past 5 years, there have been rapid advances at the intersection of AI and medicine. For instance, there are now over 50 FDA-cleared AI technologies, mostly in radiology and cardiology. There are over 6 randomized control trials. And finally, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services now covers 2 AI technologies for the detection of eye conditions and strokes. And a lot of this progress has been made on tasks that rely heavily on the interpretation of medical images. And this progress has been driven by advancements in algorithms and creation of data sets over the last few years. So on the algorithmic front, the improvement of convolutional neural network architectures and training of deep learning models has enabled progress for medical imaging applications. And the success of these algorithms has been enabled by the curation of large labeled data sets for medical imaging. Today, I want to talk about 3 key challenges for progress in the field. The first challenge facing the field is progressing from developing algorithms that solve a narrow set of tasks that require a lot of clean data to algorithms that can solve a broader range of tasks with noisy or limited labeled data commonly found in medicine. The second challenge facing the field is going from data sets that are small, noisy, and homogeneous to data sets that are large, high quality, and heterogeneous. Finally, the third challenge facing the field is going from studies that evaluate the standalone performance of algorithms to studies that evaluate algorithms as clinical decision support tools. During my PhD, I've made contributions towards each of these directions. And as I share challenges, I will also share some of the advancements that have been made and opportunities for progress. So without further ado, let's dive in. I want to start off by sharing a study that I led, published in Nature Medicine, where we developed a model to diagnose irregular heart rhythms from ECGs at the level of cardiologists. And this study was done in collaboration with iRhythm Technologies and cardiologists at Stanford and UCSF. And in 2019, this algorithm received FDA clearance and has been used and is being used as part of real patient care at iRhythm. So here we developed a 34-layer convolutional neural network to detect arrhythmias in arbitrary length ECG time series. So the network takes as input a time series of a raw ECG signal and outputs a sequence of labeled predictions. Now, to make the optimization of such a deep model tractable, we use residual connections and batch normalization, which enable us to train significantly deeper networks. This depth increases both the nonlinearity of the computation as well as the size of the context window used for each classification decision. Now, distinct from some other DNN approaches at the time, we found no significant pre-processing of ECG data, such as Fourier or wavelet transforms, was needed to actually achieve strong classification performance. The modeling choice of training a deep neural network end-to-end was enabled by our ability to construct a large ECG data set that underwent expert annotation for a broad range of ECG rhythm classes. The data set, which was ultimately contained data from 30,000 patients, was 2 orders of magnitude larger than previous data sets of its kind. And this was an early demonstration of the powerful combination of deep learning modeling combined with construction of large data sets, leading to performance that's comparable to medical experts. For 2D medical imaging tasks, advancements in deep learning for image classification have enjoyed relatively straightforward application to attain a very high level of performance. In 2018, I led the development of a study, this was published in PLOS Medicine, that demonstrated that AI models were able to make diagnoses from chest x-rays at a level of performance comparable to radiologists. And there were similar studies published by other groups demonstrating successful application to tasks in ophthalmology, dermatology, and pathology. Now, there's good news and bad news here for the future of such algorithms. The good news is that algorithms developed outside the context of medical imaging have translated really well to the medical image setting and enabled all of these applications. There are still domain-specific insights that are useful to handle the noise, handle class imbalance, and handle the resolution of medical images, but we've gotten a long way with the application of computer vision algorithms. The bad news, however, is that it's very difficult and expensive to be able to annotate data at the scale. And if we're trying to go from being able to solve a narrow range of tasks to a much broader range of tasks, we need to be able to solve this bottleneck. And I'm going to talk about 2 possible solutions for this challenge: transfer learning and self-supervised learning. One of the clearest go-tos for medical imaging has been transfer learning. Here we take a model that was initially trained to detect classes such as penguins or cats or dogs in images from the ImageNet dataset and apply it to medical imaging tasks. Transfer learning using pre-trained ImageNet models has been the standard approach for developing 2D medical imaging models, now at least for the past 7 years. And for a while, applying the best performing architecture on ImageNet to one of the medical imaging data sets used to produce better results on the medical imaging task. The assumption here was that better ImageNet architectures perform better and that the pre-trained weights boost performance on the target medical tasks. But around 2 years ago, our group and other groups saw that these benefits had stopped translating. So last year, I decided to lead a study to perform a systematic investigation of how ImageNet architectures and weights both relate to the performance on downstream medical tasks. So we asked 3 questions as part of this study. The first question is whether ImageNet performance was correlated with performance on a medical image interpretation task. And we performed this investigation with 16 common convolution architectures and focused on chest X-ray interpretation tasks. And surprisingly, we found that the answer was no. We showed that there was no relationship between ImageNet and performance on chest X-rays. This finding suggests that architecture improvements on ImageNet may not lead to improvements on medical imaging tasks. Now, this finding is very different from a similar investigation in the setting of natural images, which found a significant correlation between ImageNet performance and transfer performance on typical image classification datasets. This difference in results could be attributed to unique aspects of the medical image interpretation task and data attributes of chest X-rays. And understanding this transfer gap remains a fundamental open question. Continuing on with this study, we asked, well, does model architecture matter? And we found that the answer is yes. So for models without pre-training, we found that the choice of architecture family like DenseNet or ResNet has quite a big influence on performance. A notable finding of our work is that newer architectures generated through search on ImageNet, such as EfficientNet, MobileNet, or MNASNet, underperform older architectures like DenseNet and ResNet. This finding suggests that search may have overfit to ImageNet to the detriment of medical task performance, and that ImageNet may not be an appropriate benchmark for selecting architectures for medical imaging tasks. Instead, architectures derived from search and selection on large medical data sets may allow us to achieve higher performance for medical imaging tasks, and there's better empirical and theoretical understanding that's required here. Continuing on with this study, the third question we ask is, well, does ImageNet pre-training help? Here we found that ImageNet pre-training did yield a boost in performance across architectures, which is denoted on the y-axis here, with a higher boost for smaller architectures, here seen with the number of parameters on the x-axis. This finding supports the ImageNet pre-training paradigm for medical imaging tasks, especially for smaller models. So overall, our recent study contributes new experimental evidence about the relation of ImageNet to chest X-ray interpretation performance. It does open up many fundamental questions about the reasons for this transfer benefit and gap to ImageNet that I think will be important for us in the machine learning community to address. Now, one of the key opportunities for transfer learning is in its application to 3D volumetric images. And one way that transfer learning has been commonly applied to 3D volumetric images is to apply a convolutional neural network to each slice and then aggregate the result. For example, in a 2018 study we published in PLOS Medicine, I led the development of an algorithm that showed high performance of a model to interpret knee MRI images. So here, each two-dimensional MRI image slice is passed through a 2D ConvNet to obtain features for each slice, and then a max pooling operation across slices is applied to obtain a prediction probability for the whole MRI sequence. And using a pre-trained ConvNet with just over 1,000 MRI training exams, we're able to get close to the performance of radiologists. Now, interpretation of cross-sectional medical images often requires 3D context. In such setups, rather than apply 2D CNNs, 3D CNNs may be able to better capture the relationship between different slices. However, 3D CNNs have typically not been successfully applied to many tasks because they overfit quickly to small or medium-sized data sets. One of the ideas that I got excited about in 2019 was the idea of transferring from 3D CNNs trained on natural videos for activity recognition onto medical images. And that's what we showed in our study last year, which was published in Scientific Reports, which was the first successful demonstration of video pre-training on medical data to reduce the number of training examples required. We proposed a two-step method in which we first pre-trained a 3D deep learning model on a data set of natural videos, specifically kinetics, which is a collection of over 500,000 YouTube video clips. Then in the second step, we fine-tuned that model on a small data set of 400 CT scans annotated for appendicitis. And we found that the results were astonishing. The diagnostic performance of a 3D model increased from 0.72 without pre-training to 0.81 with pre-training after training on a data set of only 400 CT exams. The particular architecture we developed uses a 3D convolutional network architecture, which consists of 4 stacked residual blocks with the same structure across stages, and this follows the 2D equivalent of residual blocks. But we also found that video pre-training increased the performance of other 3D architectures as ImageNet pre-training increased the performance of 2D architectures. And we've since applied this idea of video pre-training to other tasks, including to the detection of intracranial aneurysms in head CTAs, to the detection of pulmonary embolism in CT scans. And our work shows the utility of pre-training with videos with a small clinical dataset size, and we believe this could generalize to other cross-sectional medical imaging applications with limited data sets. Of course, this gives rise to some natural open questions about the effect of transfer learning on the kinds of representations that are being learned by these models. One, does transfer learning from video in fact result in any representational differences compared to training from random initialization? Does feature reuse take place? And if so, where exactly? And finally, when is pre-training on an in-domain data set more useful than on data sets like kinetics? And these are open questions that I'm interested in tackling in the future. Next, I want to talk about an emerging—
Can I ask a question? A couple slides ago, I think you gave a classification. You compared to pre-training to non-pre-training, and there was a classification error. Can you interpret this for us? It's not clear what these numbers mean. I mean, like the significance of 0.724 to 0.81.
Sure, yeah, happy to. So in terms of the comparison here, do you mean what does it mean for there to be a jump in a 0.1 AUC between the not pre-trained and the pre-trained model?
I mean, I don't find error under this particular curve just by itself to be particularly meaningful. I guess maybe if you've played with this particular data set, then it means something, but it seems that, I mean, like operationally, you're trying to perform at the end of the day some medical task. So what is this, how does this translate to success or failure on the task?
Sure. So maybe I'll answer that question in different aspects. So you could say AUC gives us an indication of discriminative performance without regard to operating point. So we can do this comparison in an operating point space as well. And we've done this in the paper where you can fix the sensitivity that you would expect in clinic and compare the specificity operating points. And the same story holds. Of course, you can argue that we not only care about discriminative performance, we also care about calibration. We also care about the downstream clinical effects. And that's not what we're measuring at all here. I think our focus here was on the discriminative performance of those models on a data set, which we collected specifically for the task of detecting whether or not there's appendicitis.
Thank you, thanks.
Cool, yeah, and we can revisit this point towards the end of the talk or offline if you have any further questions. I'll move on here to talk about self-supervised learning that I feel is a technique that's really well positioned to make rapid progress in medical settings. Self-supervised approaches have recently demonstrated many successful applications being able to learn representations without labels to produce pre-trained models for subsequent fine-tuning on labeled data. And the most competitive methods for learning representations without labels have been self-supervised contrastive learning. These methods learn representations through a contrastive loss, which pushes apart dissimilar data pairs while pulling together similar pairs. And I want to dive into some recent work that I led demonstrating the successful adaptation of contrastive learning from the natural image setting to the medical image setting, and then talk about the development of methods that take into account medical metadata into the learning. So as background, in contrastive learning, the selection of pairs controls the information contained in learned representations. So for natural images, positive pairs are typically created using different augmented views of the same image. On the other hand, negative pairs are views of different images. So given a set of augmentations T and an encoder G, most contrastive learning algorithms involve minimizing the info NCE loss. Here, for a query image X, we define two augmentations, X1, which is from transformation T1 of X, and augmentation X2, which is from transformation T2 of X. And the negative pairs for X1 are transformations of other images ZI. And these ZIs come either from a Q in the case of a method like momentum contrast, or the mini batch in the case of SimClear. So I led a study late last year that demonstrated that we can make a straightforward modification to the data augmentation strategy by defining T to be a composition of augmentations commonly used for chest X-ray interpretation. And using this relatively straightforward modification, we found that using just a small fraction of labeled training data, a model pre-trained using contrastive learning could have a huge boost in performance on a data set, especially only when a fraction of that data set is labeled. To the best of our knowledge, this work was the first to show the application of contrastive learning to chest X-ray interpretation. A team at Google has since demonstrated a similar technique on chest X-ray classification, as well as on dermatology skin condition classification. and a team at Facebook and at NYU School of Medicine has applied a similar method in their recent work on using chest x-rays for COVID-19 risk prediction. Now, despite the early success of these applications, these contrastive learning studies on medical imaging have not systematically investigated how to leverage patient metadata available in medical imaging datasets to select these positive pairs. I led a recent study called MEDOG, in which we're performing an investigation of how to select these positive pairs through the use of patient metadata. The key idea in this work is that we can use patient metadata associated with a query image X, such as the patient number, study number, or laterality, to create positive pairs. We can use patient metadata to obtain an enhanced augmentation set that depends on X, where we first collect images from the same patient P, and then create a set SC of X, which is the set of all images satisfying some predefined criteria C in relation to the properties of X. We can then sample from this enhanced augmentation set when it's non-empty, and otherwise just default to using an augmentation of the same image. And this definition just lays that out more formally. The key in our formulation is that it provides us with the flexibility of experimenting with different criteria C for constraining SC using the metadata of the query X. In particular, we focus on two properties. One is the study number of an image associated with a particular patient that reflects the session or the time point in which that image was taken. So two images from two different studies might be separated by years, while images in the same study are acquired at the same time. We experiment with only using images from the same study or from different studies. Similarly, the second property we look at is laterality, as chest x-rays can either be frontal view or they can be lateral view. And we experiment with only including images from the same laterality or different ones, or keep it unrestricted. And our results clearly show improvements with this incorporation of patient metadata. We see some large improvement over the baseline, with the best result obtained when using a set of images from the same patient and same study as that of X, regardless of laterality. And we perform experiments to test hypotheses associated with some of these differences in performance. For example, we see that there is a drop in performance when moving from using images with the same study number to using images without regard for study number. The hypothesis now is that because all studies may contain images of a different disease pathology than seen in X. So as a result, the model is asked to push the representations of a diseased image closer to the representation of a non-diseased image, causing poor downstream performance. So to test out this hypothesis, we carry out an oracle experiment where we constrain the positive pairs to only include images from studies that have the same downstream label as that of X. And we find that the model pre-trained with this constraint achieves a higher performance than without this constraint. So this experiment supports our hypothesis that positive pairs from images with different downstream labels hurt performance. Similarly, we also investigate the performance drop when moving from using images across all studies of the same patient to images with a different study number from the current query image. This finding may also support our hypothesis that positive pairs from images with different downstream labels hurt performance, because there is a larger proportion of positive pairs of different disease pathologies in pairs of images from different studies. Here, we have to make sure that we're controlling for the size of the available sets and that we're not using any contributions from positive pairs formed from the same image. So we implement these two controls for this comparison, and we see that the all study strategy outperforms the same patient distinct study strategy, even when the size of these augmentation sets is controlled. Our controlled experiments are thus showing that one of the keys to improving downstream performance on disease classification is using patient metadata to appropriately create positive pairs from different images with the same underlying pathologies. So I think self-supervised learning will have huge applications in medicine, especially since it's defined by the presence of large quantities of unlabeled data. One particularly interesting opportunity in medicine is that we can use these heterogeneous data sources to be able to set up self-supervised tasks and make fast progress. And I'm interested in collaborating with CS faculty to further our theoretical and empirical understanding of these methods, especially as they apply to medicine. So that concludes the first piece of the puzzle, the algorithms, the advancements of which will be necessary if we want to go from the 50 FDA-cleared technologies to hundreds in the next few years. And these algorithms will be enabled by challenging what it means to have enough labeled data. Moving to the second piece of the puzzle is the data sets. I believe that those who build data sets have the opportunity to steer advancements in technology towards a particular direction. Early on in my PhD, I had the opportunity to lead the development of the Stanford Question Answering Dataset, also called SQUAD, in 2016, with the goal of tracking the progress of computer algorithms on the fundamental task of answering questions from text. SQUAD was recognized with Best Paper Awards at EMNLP 2016 and ACL 2018, and has driven advancements from deep learning models from top institutions and companies, including Google, Microsoft, Facebook, AI2. Some of these models are integrated into our search engines today. And SQUAD has also enabled applications back in the biomedical domain, where SQUAD is often used as the pre-training data set or even in zero-shot transfer settings. I think in the context of medicine, dataset building is even harder. Dataset curation requires building partnerships with hospital administrators. It requires frameworks for securely handling and de-identifying data. And on top of that, it requires strategy for data organization and annotation. It often requires domain experts to annotate these large data sets. So when an institution like Google was able to demonstrate advancements in diabetic retinopathy, they had a team of 50 ophthalmology residents annotating hundreds of thousands of retinal fundus photos. And that's not a scale of resources that most teams in the world have access to. But I also don't think that's a scale of resources that is required to make progress on these tasks. When I started working on chest X-ray interpretation in 2017, we were excited by the release of the NIH Chest X-ray 14 dataset because it was an order of magnitude larger than previous datasets. But what I really liked about the dataset was that it wasn't generated through painstaking manual annotation with experts. The key that the NIH team was using was finding ways to label the data using data that was already collected. In this particular case, to annotate a bunch of chest X-rays, an NLP tool was applied on the radiology reports that had been written at the time of clinical interpretation. Now, we used these labels to train a medical imaging model that we ultimately showed had the same level of performance as that of a radiologist. But at the time, there was overwhelming criticism of the quality of the labels that were generated using this approach. A famous blog post written at the time manually analyzed some of the images and their corresponding labels in the data set and found very frequent mistakes in the labeling. To address this label noise, I started leading the development of an improved radiology report extraction system. We started off with the NLP tool developed by the NIH team, which was state-of-the-art at the time, and improved both the step of recognizing the mention of diseases and the step to determine whether their presence was negated or whether their presence was deemed as uncertain in the radiology report. And so we developed a labeler called the Checkspert labeler and showed that it had much better performance at being able to label these reports on a large data set from the Stanford Hospital. At the same time, we also learned of an effort at MIT and Harvard also aimed at labeling chest X-ray images, and we shared our labeler with them to understand how well it would do on their patient population. And we found more accurate labels on their data set as well. Now, even with this advancement, we knew that there was still room for improvement, especially with edge cases that our hand engineering of these rule-based systems wasn't really able to capture. So the question was whether we could leverage this rule-based system to bootstrap learning from expert manual annotations. And that's what we showed in our work published last year in EMNLP, where we developed an approach to train a biomedically pre-trained BERT model on the labels of an existing labeler and then fine-tune it on augmented expert labels. Here we showed that we can combine the rule-based system with these expert annotations to be able to do better than with either alone. We've since open sourced our labeler for application to chest X-ray reports from other institutions, and this approach may be broadly generalizable to other biomedical NLP tasks where existing rule-based systems are available. Now, in late 2018, we established a pipeline at Stanford to be able to release these chest X-ray images and labels, and then coordinated with the MIT team to be able to jointly release 2 of the largest data sets of chest X-rays to the world. At Stanford, over the last few years, I've also led the development of similar efforts to be able to construct and make public data sets of bone X-rays and knee MRIs. And these data sets have been used in the community to demonstrate both the development and analysis of algorithms. They have used for pre-training purposes, most recently by the Facebook and NYU effort for their COVID prediction algorithms. They've been used for ethics studies looking at race and gender and their impact on algorithm performance. These data sets thus have had a wide impact in the community. There's also a leaderboard associated with the data set that's allowed us to track progress on this particular task. Over the last 2 years, there have been over 160 submissions, and there's been significant advancements in the performance of these top models. And just to give you an indication of this, the model that we had designed at Stanford, which we had shown was comparable to radiologists, is now number 88 on the leaderboard. So what did the top models do differently that we didn't know about a couple of years ago? There are a couple of ideas around the incorporation of a medical hierarchy in the training process and the handling of uncertainty labels that a few of the top models use that have been especially critical for those high-performing models. In a recent study looking at the generalizability of these models, we observed that these models not only maintained higher than average radiologist performance on the Stanford set, they actually maintained a higher than average radiologist performance on a totally different institution's data as well. And that's fairly promising for the translation of these technologies to the clinical setting. So that's good news, but where do we go from here? The leaderboard seems to have saturated in terms of progress, especially over the last few months. So what kind of data sets should we be designing to enable progress towards successful deployment of these algorithms in clinical settings? And I'll give you one example of this. One of my ideas for the deployment of algorithms for chest X-ray interpretation actually came at a hackathon 3 years ago. A group of undergrad students I was working with at the time and I decided to build an app that would allow for anyone to snap a photo of an X-ray and run it through an algorithm, which would then come back with a list of diagnoses. And so we prototyped this, and some of the time it would work and some of the time it would fail, but it was really cool when it worked. And this is a very different deployment strategy than one in which an algorithm is integrated into the PACS system within a hospital IT workflow. And this really represents an opportunity to be able to go into environments where radiology still has not gone digital. And we've come a long way with this technology in the last year. Right after one of my demos of this app at a radiology conference, I spoke with a person who got excited about this opportunity to deploy this as part of a nonprofit in Vietnam, and we started collaborating to make this possible. One extra reason this was particularly appealing for the radiology workflow in some of the hospitals in Vietnam is that even with a digital system, the workflow is to print out the chest X-rays, which are then interpreted by the radiologists. In the last year, with the support of a large engineering team and with the support of the Vietnam government and several hospitals, this technology has now been piloted in over 63 hospitals. One of the challenges here has been to try and understand whether there is a drop in performance by the algorithms when we're applying them to photos of chest X-rays. And we've had some evidence of this when trying to pilot this technology in the Stanford Emergency Department with emergency care physicians. A more formal analysis has showed that there is a drop in performance on some pathologies, likely because of the distribution shift associated with having photos of X-rays. Now, to address this distribution shift, early last year, I started leading the development of a data set of photos of chest X-rays, and this data set called ChexPhoto has been live as of late last year. This data set contains photos of chest X-rays that were generated as part of an automated phone capture system to continuously take smartphone photos of chest X-rays on the screen. Our data set also consists of synthetic photographic transformations of chest X-rays to make them look like photos of chest X-rays. Finally, we're collecting a test set where we include not just images from the Stanford Hospital, but also real deployment settings in Vietnam, and we'll be launching this competition over the next couple of months. And so we're continuing to develop data sets that will play a role in shaping the next generation of advances in medical technologies towards the widespread and safe deployment of these algorithms in the clinical settings. The third piece of the puzzle, beyond the algorithms and the data, is the treatment of this technology not as an isolated component, but as a part of a system where it supports clinical decision-making by real people. And I think for this field, for research in computer science, particularly in human-computer interaction, this will play a key role in coming years. The question here has to change from, is the algorithm performing as well as a medical expert, to, is the medical expert actually improving in performance when collaborating with an algorithm? And there are many ways to set up this collaboration. Let me first share a very simple example where we're combining independent predictions made by a model and a medical expert. I recently led a study with collaborators in the Center for Reproductive Health at UCSF that aimed at predicting the survival of freeze-thaw embryos. We created a simple combination of an expert prediction score with a model prediction score and compared it to either by itself. And we found that this combination performed better than either alone. So this is really hopeful in terms of this model expert combination. I think the more important collaboration setup is to study when the outputs of the algorithms are presented to the clinician for decision-making, how does the clinician perform? I led an early study on this. This was published in PLOS Medicine, which demonstrated improvements by radiologists on the task of interpreting knee MRIs. In this setup, we looked at general radiologists and orthopedic surgeons at Stanford who read exams twice, once with model assistance and once without model assistance, separated by a washout period of at least 10 days. And in this case, the assistance was in the form of probabilities provided for 3 tasks, whether or not the study was abnormal, whether or not there was an ACL tear, or whether or not there was a meniscal tear. And we found that across these 3 tasks, we observed significant improvements in the specificity for detecting ACL tears. There were no other statistically significant improvements, but there was generally improvements on all 3 tasks. And this was one of the first studies to demonstrate the performance improvements of clinicians on a radiology task with deep learning assistance. We followed up this work with a more complex and realistic augmentation setup. Around this time, I started working with pathologists at Stanford on the task of subtyping liver cancers. And we developed a model to be able to distinguish hepatocellular carcinoma from cholangiocarcinoma. I led the development of a study exploring the effect of AI assistance on pathologists for this particular task. This was published in NPGA Digital Medicine last year. For this study, we built out a tool that allowed pathologists to take screenshots of whatever patch they found to be the most informative, and then upload that onto a web platform that we built to be able to make an AI diagnosis within seconds, and then they would incorporate this prediction probability into their decision. And we found for this study that the improvements in the pathologist performance as a group wasn't significant. When we break down the improvement at the level of individual pathologists, we did not find any conclusive evidence that it helped less experienced trainees more than it helped specialists, but that may also have been due to a small sample size. What we did find here was that there is a relationship between model correctness and expert correctness. When the model was correct, pathologists had 4.3 times the odds of the correct diagnosis versus without. When the model was wrong, pathologists had 0.3 times the odds of making the correct diagnosis versus without. So overall, the finding that inaccurate model predictions can have strong negative impact, even on subspecialty pathologists, raises concerns about the unintended effects of decision support tools, such as automation bias. And one of the ideas that sprung up here is maybe we should be training the medical experts to get some exposure to the algorithm and feedback on their decisions before they're tested on it. So a final study I'll talk about which addressed this was the most recent study published in September 2020, where we tried to understand further these aspects of this expert AI collaboration, this time with some collaborators in the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And we set out to determine whether we could improve the performance of physicians on the task of diagnosing active TB from chest x-rays and lab values for HIV-positive patients. In this study, we not only gave physicians access to the algorithm's estimated likelihood, but also to algorithm explanations provided in the form of a heat map over the image that was highlighting the areas which were most consistent with active TB according to the algorithm. We also gave the physician training cases where they received immediate feedback on their diagnosis after the submission before we started testing them. Here we found that the assistants did increase the performance of the physicians as a group from 0.6 to 0.65, which was promising. But the surprising finding here was that the algorithm performed a lot better just by itself. We found that the improvement was not consistent across the physicians, with some physicians getting better while the other physicians got worse. Now, we had two possible explanations of the finding that the standalone algorithm performed better than the clinicians who had access to its output. First, that there's some degree of mistrust in the algorithm's output or overconfidence in the clinician's own diagnosis when submitting a final answer. Second, that the representation of the algorithm's diagnostic probability as a coarse category from 1 to 5 rather than a percent may have introduced additional uncertainty. So I think for the future, we need to be thinking about developing more hypotheses and frameworks around the relationships between the effective AI technologies and factors like experience levels, clinician interaction, case difficulty, and automation bias. And I'm interested in interaction studies and collaborating with human-computer interaction, folks which target these hypotheses and build these frameworks for clinician AI collaboration. And that concludes the third piece of the puzzle, where we're really transitioning to orient around the challenges and opportunities of human AI collaboration. So as a summary, I think even though there has been incredible progress in the field of AI for medicine over the past 5 years, there's a lot of work ahead in terms of being able to make these technologies a routine part of clinical care. I think if we can start thinking about algorithms that work in the presence of noise or limited data availability, if we can start curating data sets that will enable this next generation of algorithms, and if we can start designing studies that target the assessment of human AI collaboration, then I think we can start making incredible impact in the next few years. I'll close by saying I hope more people will join us in our efforts. So towards this goal, I've designed and instructed a Coursera course series on AI for medicine. I write a newsletter with Dr. Eric Topol that highlights recent papers in the space, and also started the AI Health podcast, where we chat with entrepreneurs, investors, and scientists in the space. I've had the fortune of collaborating with several clinicians and computer scientists across various specialties in the last few years, and I strongly believe that interdisciplinary collaboration will be required to make progress. Just over 3 years ago, I started a program at Stanford called the AI for Healthcare Bootcamp just to enable such collaboration. This is a 6-month training program for undergrad and master's students where I've worked with and mentored just over 100 students on research at this intersection. And this effort has led close to 30 papers, which are either published or in review. This is my reference list for the papers, many of which I talked about today and many of which were produced as part of this bootcamp. Over the next few years, I hope to be able to collaborate with many of you and continue making progress on this field that just seems to be getting more and more exciting with time. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Pranav. Very interesting work. I think we can take questions now, and we had one person who already put one in chat is Ludwig Schmidt, our newest faculty member. Ludwig, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thanks. Hi, Pranav.
Hey.
Very cool work. I was wondering about a specific detail on slide 13, when you had this plot x-axis, imaginal accuracy, y-axis, X-ray accuracy, and it was a plateauing trend. And what I was wondering there specifically is, what is the human performance level, or what is the performance ceiling? So if it's 0.86 where human expert would land, then it's maybe not surprising that we are plateauing there? Or do you think you can get much higher in terms of numbers?
Sure. So for this particular study, the comparison to humans isn't made on the AUC itself. So the way we compare on this particular study is we count the number of radiologists who are under the ROC curve of the models. So I guess here what would be good to know is, on average, for an AUC of 0.86, what is the average number of radiologists under the ROC curve? I don't have that information right now, but I'm curious. How would you think about that?
Oh, basically, so what I'm curious about is the following. So if I don't know how noisy the test set is, right? It could be that there's enough noise in the labels that you just can't do better than 0.86 AUC. This is sort of the performance ceiling for the task. And if that's the case, then it's sort of natural to expect that at some point ImageNet accuracy becomes decorrelated from X-ray accuracy.
Cool. Yeah, I should be able to answer that. I know this is not the ceiling performance for the following reason. These models all use a fairly straightforward training approach, where we're not using the two top tricks used by the models that are at the top of the leaderboard, one of which is conditional training, and the second one, which is label smoothing regularization. So both those tricks get the top models up to a performance of 0.92. So this is not the ceiling. I know that much. There's room for improvement here.
Okay, thanks. So there's part of the performance that comes from ImageNet, and part of it is orthogonal to just improving ImageNet architectures, and you need to take uncertainty into account. Cool, thanks.
Yeah.
We have a question from Shima Nofala, who is a student working in medical image analysis.
Thank you, Linda. Very interesting talk, Pranav. Yeah, I had one question on your last project on pathology. So you mentioned that after showing the reason behind the diagnosis, as I understand, the reason behind that, it improved the diagnosis by pathologists. But as I recall, you said it was different from one pathologist to another. Was there any pattern for like less experience or more experienced pathologists on that?
Yeah, so this has been a personal interest of mine, is finding these relationships. I've got mixed results from the different studies that I've done. So in one of the studies where we were looking at head CTAs and the detection of cerebral aneurysms, when we looked at the improvement in performance, I actually have this slide. Let me see if I can find it. Here it is. So this is a slide for that. And here's one relationship that's interesting here. So the radiologist that performs the worst unaugmented actually has the highest improvement in performance. And the one that had the one that had the highest performance, that's the X, without augmentation, had the lowest improvement. Now you can argue this is maybe because there's not much space for improvement, but this is certainly one of the patterns that I'm looking out for and understanding when this pattern holds and when it breaks. But that's what we've been finding, is sort of, this is certainly true in some studies, but doesn't seem to be consistent across all the studies that we've done thus far.
I will comment on that, Shima and I regularly meet with our PI who's an epidemiology pathologist who are somewhat expert, and one of them constantly not only attacks the diagnosis of the automatic program, but also challenges of the 3 experts who gave the gold standard on this data set, that it's quite possible that they will never agree. All right, now we have some more hands and they're raised in a different way. I'll just take them in the order I see them. I see Gabe, would you like to speak?
Yeah, thank you for a very clear presentation. So for improving, for such high stakes deployment, it seems like improving the clinician performance is the key. But even if you are just looking at automation performance, are there other metrics besides accuracy or AUC that one cares about? For example, do you have to get robustness of these models, or do you have to continuously monitor them?
Yeah, no, I think that's very important, and it depends on deployment context. So one case in which you can argue that discriminative performance is key is if you're trying to do a work list triage. So right now, the way work list triage works in a lot of places is exams are looked at in the same order that patients came in. Now, you could argue that if you could reorder the work list such that you're able to say, let's put the patients I think are going to have the most emergent situations first in my work list, and that's the reordering, then I would be able to assign that to the radiologist. So that's a case in which the AUC is going to have a direct mapping onto who I'm going to see first. The other aspects that we care about, depending on how this is deployed, is number one, I would say calibration of the models. If we're looking at probabilities, we need to be able to make claims about how calibrated the probabilities are if we're to show them to the clinicians, and making sure that's you know, those probability outputs are calibrated is going to be important. And related to that, though not entirely the same concept, is going to be the uncertainty associated with those predictions as well. And, you know, if there's a wide range versus a narrow confidence band associated with the prediction, that's also useful to convey. And I think being able to evaluate that is as important. I think robustness is important. I think with robustness, my perspective on robustness is if you can a priori define what you need to be robust to in a deployment setting, robustness is much easier than if you don't know what you're trying to think about. So that's what I always try to think about, is what are the 5 things that we know we need to be robust to in terms of human decision making in the context of the deployment. We can plan to screen a priori for that. You can also think about having sort of, you know, evaluation associated with explainability here. So one of the ways of going about that is you can say, okay, I'm going to generate these explanation maps, these heat maps, and GradChem is one popular method of doing this. How well do they agree with a radiologist segmentation of the true diagnosis? And we've done some recent work showing that there's correlations between some of the attributes of the different pathologies and, you know, their size and their shape characteristics that make us understand that we should trust these explanations in some situations more than we should trust them in others. So I think there are lots of different attributes. I think it matters a lot what the deployment and the use case is in order to be able to make this jump from beyond AUC and accuracy to other metrics that are important as well.
Did you see an improvement in appropriate reliance from those explanations?
In terms of clinician trust as a basis of that?
Maybe end-to-end decision making. For example, did it reduce automation bias? Can I look at the explanation and say, I should have trusted this, or I shouldn't have?
Yep. So that's not something that's been investigated in the study that I just mentioned. That's a good next step. But right now, we've just tried to establish a relationship between the localization performance of these explanation method, of one of the explanation methods with the ground truth segmentation.
Cool. Thanks.
Okay, the next question is from Paul Beam.
So actually, Sham, you can go first and I'll go after.
All right, Sham Golakota.
Sure. Thanks, Pranav, for a very clear talk. The question I had was about using this for improving the performance of clinicians. The AUCs in the most average cases went from 0.90 to 0.95. So do you think that 0.05 is sufficient to motivate the hospital administrations to adopt this tool? In particular, given that physicians are really not that comfortable acknowledging that they're wrong?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of that, we need a utility analysis. You know, there's, of course, you know, in all these studies, we're showing statistical significance. And you're bringing up the point that we need to show clinical significance as well. And at what point, at what threshold do we believe a 5% versus a 2% is going to make a difference? And I think utility analysis tools will allow us to determine how much of a saving can we expect in terms of cost here, how much of an improvement in outcome can we expect. But you can also take the purist approach on this and say, if we can save even one bad decision and make that convert into some positive value without any sacrifice in cost, because let's assume it's zero cost to implement these models, and that's not so much of a stretch to assume in a lot of these cases, then I think any benefit can be thought of as a good improvement if we can show sort of at baseline it's not going to make things worse for any subpopulation. And this is hard to establish, but I think that's a good sort of motivation of showing that 5% improvement might translate into something useful.
And the cost of implementing the thing is one thing. The other thing is also retraining the physicians, retraining the clinicians to use the tools. There's a cost involved in that as well, right?
Yeah, there is, but I'm just going to add to that my experience of talking to people in less resource available environments is that the people who are trying to make these decisions on site are not trained in the first place, and they would really benefit from someone or something that is complementing their decision. So just as an example, one of our collaborators was in Tanzania for the last 6 months, and she went home at 8 p.m. And any decision that was made between 8 p.m. and her coming back at 8 a.m. the next day was decision that was based on hunches, not on medical training. And often in those cases, I think these technologies are going to make quite a big improvement. And just as, just to be conservative, a lot of the comparisons we're making right now, we're making these comparisons with really good experts. We're not making these comparisons with, this is the best case scenario. This is the worst case scenario. The best case scenario where this is a lower bound for the improvement that we would actually expect when these things are deployed from the perspective of who's using it.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. In fact, we're not making these tools for people at UW Medicine to use. They don't actually need them. But one of our 3 pathologists, Oliver, is at VA hospital, and he's the only dermatopathologist in the entire 5-state region, and there's no one else to help him. And the VAs from all over the country send him slides to diagnose. There's no one to do it. And like you said, in Tanzania and other countries, there isn't anyone who knows how to do this stuff. So a program has got to be better. Okay, now Paul Beam.
Sure. So my question actually, maybe it doesn't relate so much to your prime use case, but in terms of the general situation, when we add technologies, initially they're assistive and they boost performance because we're also humanly engaged. But at some point, we actually back off and we trust the technologies to do things for us. People will start using their self-driving car in ways that they shouldn't be used to. They're backing off. So how do you see sort of longer term how this could, to encourage that expertise to be retained while you're augmenting it?
Yeah, there are many different viewpoints I've heard about this. One of the viewpoints is that a lot of the tasks we're trying to automate, there was never any interest on doing in the first place from the part of the radiologists that were doing this as a narrow set of things that they're responsible for a much broader set of things. And if we're automating away the tasks that they consider to be just very time consuming and not that effective and not that stimulating, that's great. One example of this is bone age estimation from pediatric hand radiographs, which is one thing that's time consuming. And there are many examples of this, a lot of laborious segmentation that needs to happen. So there are a lot of economists that think about AI and the future of work, some of whom I'm collaborating with. And they have models around the kinds of work that the models will replace and the kinds of work that the radiologists or medical experts will continue on doing. And I think one of the optimistic futures here is that a lot of physicians can spend more time with the patients while having all these menial operations be automated by AI.
Thanks.
So I think we're about out of time. In fact, we've gone over. And I want to thank you again, Pranav, for a really thought-provoking
Thank you for having me.